Right.
So I think that they wanted to talk about science and religion. We both know a bit about science, neither of us know anything at all about religion. But I think we had this debate on the video where we talked about whether science and religion are compatible or incompatible. And I thought at least we could restage that a bit.
Yeah, or just sort of elaborate on some of the themes from that.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
this is a question
why don't you
very
make
much
the case then?
We'll make what case?
That they're not compatible.
Yeah, I mean, my own view on the matter is the sort of slightly boring one, which says roughly that people like Richard Dawkins are right. Now, that's boring because, some people have always longed for a subtler thing to say than that. And people like Dawkins are not, they're not particularly kind to their opponents, and they don't always present the most judicious case, and certainly if you're trying to persuade people of your point of view, the way Dawkins and his friends talk isn't likely to. But at the purely intellectual level, if we just consider the question of the intellectual compatibility of what any religion tells you with what modern science tells you, I mean, at face value, there's clearly a clash. Modern religion says, or different religions say the world is so many thousands of years old, and modern science tells us that that isn't true. And the first and most obvious point of factual clash. So taken literally, if you take the claims of religion non-allegorically, just literally at face value as asserting things about the universe, then you have to clearly conclude that there's a clash with science. And indeed, it seems to me that some of the most honest people in this regard are the Christian fundamentalists in the US, in the southern US, where they've always thought exactly that. They said it was obvious. There's a clash with science. There's no question of their compatibility or otherwise, and obviously that means that science is wrong. So let's not teach science in schools, let's teach them the literal truth of the book of Genesis. And in some ways I admire their straightforwardness and honesty, those people, much as I don't admire other aspects, all other aspects of them and their kind. But I do think that they haven't been tempted by this sort of view as take religion kind of allegorically, or think of it as a sort of orienting world view or something, and then we can have an interesting dialogue with religion, with science, with natural science. I personally have never seen the attraction of that sort of view. Now, it has to be said that a lot of people beg to differ, and indeed, very, very informed, intelligent people. So, I mean, a lot of scientists, including him, possibly. So, a lot of scientists, particularly in physics, have wanted to say things like, there's no immediate logical route from natural science to atheism. And I think that, on a point of logic, that's probably correct. I mean, it's not incompatible just to say that there is a God, and yet a lot of what science tells us is true. But you have to ask whether there's really any reason to think that, and whether the ordinary canons of evidential scrutiny on which the sciences are based, not asserting things for which you haven't got evidence, should not immediately render that attempt to rescue a kind of very minimal religiosity or minimal version of theism from a scientific perspective immediately suspect. So that's broadly speaking my view. I mean, if obviously we have to be mindful of the fact that science is an evolving creature, an evolving beast, and what we today take to be scientific orthodoxy will no doubt be laughed out of court by the science of 200 years from now, much as we look back on, let's say the early 1800s as a period, although of great advance, we take the scientific worldview presented then to be largely wrong in many respects, and we also scoff at the naivety of some of those scientists who, in the wake of Newton, thought that basically they'd uncovered the way the universe was, only to be proved dramatically wrong time and again in the 20th century. So we've got to be obviously modest in our appreciation of what science does, and acknowledge that it's likely to change in the future, possibly in ways that are dramatic and that we can't foresee. So I don't think it's useful to sort of insist on the modern contemporary scientific worldview as the final truth of the matter. But I still don't see that modesty that reflecting on the history of science forces on you. I don't see that as in any way simply, as conceding anything to people who say, oh, maybe science and religion can all go hand in hand. Because that's simply saying, look, the outer reaches of science, not the basic stuff, like the Earth going around the sun, but the outer reaches of modern physics, perhaps neuroscience, where the science of consciousness is kind of in its infancy, perhaps branches of psychology. I mean, maybe there are amazing things to discover that we can't even conceive of now, maybe. But I don't see the doubt about the scientific enterprise that results from that as really, in any useful way, implying that we should say things like, oh, it's possible that, after all, there is a God, and that science and religion will enjoy some happy reconciliation in the future. To my mind, that's a fantasy, and we should know better than to say that. Now, I realise here that I'm making James's life pretty difficult, in that what I'm telling you is what I would regard as sort of mildly educated common sense, really, and by, which many people agree with. Now, of course, it's a different matter, whether religion might have some spiritual value for the people who partake in it. And the evidence is that it does. The evidence is it makes people happier, if they're religious. Particularly people who are ill, approaching the end of their lives. I mean, there's incontrovertible psychological evidence that it's good for you, and some suggestions that it's good for society, that it makes people, kind of pro-social in their dispositions towards others. And I think you have to look at the bloody history of religious wars as well. Have a balanced judgment on that point. But leaving aside all of that, which might be regarded as, you could characterize as the sort of therapeutic benefits of religion, if any, just on the purely intellectual level, I see no grounds for anything other than outright conflict between science and religion, and a conflict that's been won.
Okay. Well, I suppose there's two things that particularly bolt out in what Samir says. I'll come here and use this. The first was when he said that he admired the honesty of the creation scientists. It's a very fairly pejorative way to put it. I mean, that suggests, that implicitly supposes that the people who don't advocate a fundamentalist interpretation of religion are being dishonest about what it is to be religious. But I don't think that's right. I think that lots of people who are religious for completely independent reasons think that you shouldn't be a fundamentalist about religion.
I mean, sort of biblical literalist, really.
Biblical literalist.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, as I said, I think lots of people who are religious think that you shouldn't be a biblical literalist. And so therefore, to sort of put things differently is not to be dishonest, it's just to say what they think. And lots of people also think that you don't have to pay any attention to science to work out that biblical literalism is not viable, because the Bible's self-contradictory. So, or at least it says lots of things which plenty of people don't want to believe, even though they're religious. So, in the book of Leviticus, it says, it's all right to have slaves, and I know, really objectionable stuff about homosexuality, prescribing the exact method of how you have to put people to death for homosexuality, all sorts of prescriptions on menstruating women, lots of stuff which lots of religious people don't want to believe in, and which seems incompatible with other things in the Bible, like Jesus saying there's only two laws: love your God as you love yourself, and love your neighbour as you love yourself, right? That seems to conflict with putting people to death for being homosexual. So lots of people would say, I think, who are religious, that biblical interpretation has to be engaged in anyway. There's an interpretative task, a non-trivial interpretative task, to work out what of it you should believe and what you shouldn't. And then, I think, as well, lots of them would say that it's just a kind of category mistake, although one that historically was a mistake that was made, that there's a kind of category mistake to conflate the proper business of religion with natural history. Okay, so they'll say, look, we have to understand this, things like the Old Testament, these books were written down when there wasn't a clear demarcation between being a scientist and a historian and being a theologian, right, or a religious thinker. And so mixed into the books of the Old Testament, you get lots of history of the tribes and lots of stuff about battles and what happened and so on, and some false history about how old the earth is and whatever else. And that's not the important content of the Bible. Right? The important content is the moral and spiritual teaching and stuff about the nature of God. And so, if you take that perspective, which I think lots of religious people have, then you certainly can't find any incompatibility between science and religion at the level of, well, the Earth's much older than they say it is, so it's all rubbish. Now, then it just really turns out, well, in that case, the question is science incompatible with the existence of God? Now, my own view is that the existence of God faces a much more challenging problem that's got nothing to do with science, namely the problem of evil. So I would think there's just no problem that science could throw up that could possibly be as bad as that one. Because God is supposed to be perfectly good and perfectly powerful and all-knowing, and yet innocents suffer, and it seems like either God knows about it, could do something about it but doesn't, or God knows about it, would do something about it if he could but can't, or would do something about it if he could but doesn't know about it. And either way, in any of those three ways, one of the traditional attributes of God has to go. So there's a direct contradiction between the existence of evil and the three standard attributes of God. And we know about evil just through knowing about the world. We don't need science to know about evil. So that's not a special problem about science and religion being incompatible. Now, I suppose I kind of think if you can get your way through clear to thinking that there's a perfectly good, perfectly knowing, perfectly powerful God, in spite of the fact that there's evil, then, you know, stuff to do with science is going to be no problem for you, right? You've already, in the words of the Hitchhiker's Galaxy, you know, believed 3 impossible things before breakfast or whatever it is. And so again, I mean, I'm not giving an argument for the existence of God or an argument that it's just that we can solve the problem of evil. I'm just saying I would have thought there's much more of an internal intellectual problem with the idea of God than one coming from science.
Can I come in on that point?
Well, I don't know. I wasn't allowed to interrupt you. Have I talked for as long as you talked? Yeah.
Well, I think this could be a good point to debate, and then I'll hand back to you. And we can,
go on then. Have anyone seen the video? Samir talks a lot more than I do on the video, so I just want to keep him under control here. You don't even need to time it. Qualitatively, it's just apparent. Carry on.
Maybe what you're meaning is I get a lot more content across.
No, it's not what I mean. I mean, you talk more.
On that point, I mean, you might say, well, look, I mean, why not? If we're happy to say, oh, you know, the Bible says that the Earth's 5,000 years old, well, we can scrap that bit, we'll just hold the bit, you know, hold on to the bit we like. Why not drop the bit about God being omnipotent and all benevolent? I mean, you could hold, you know, with the Jewish faith, as I understand it, God's in some ways quite a nasty bit of work, and that, you know, he'll smite you, he'll smote you if you step out of line. I mean, I think it's I mean, that's very much a Christian notion, isn't it?
That God's perfectly good.
Yeah. I mean, you could say, what I'm saying is you could argue that the classical problem of evil afflicts one version of Christianity, maybe all versions, but not necessarily all of the other, even monotheistic religions, equally. Why not just think, well, we can give up on that bit to sort of wheedle our way out of the problem of evil?
Indeed.
Or argue with Voltaire, in fact, it's all the evil that happens in the world.
Or believe that God's not perfectly powerful, which some heretics believed, and in fact some people believe the material universe wasn't created by God, it was created by the demiurge, who is evil. Exactly, yeah, quite. But I don't see why that isn't Christian mind now, rather than yours.
Well, I'm saying if you're happy to say, well, we can drop the bit about the age of the earth and all of the other factual inaccuracies in the Bible and just hold on to this bit and say this bit is, is immune from, well, it doesn't clash with science, but is internally a problem that isn't a problem of evil. Can't we just say, well, drop the bit about his benevolence too? I mean, if we're going to just, cherry pick and try to extract some core that we think stands up to both sort of logical and philosophical scrutiny and is possibly immune from scientific refutation, then it would have to presumably be something just like that there is a God, though not necessarily with any of the Christian attributes that traditionally down with him, and not necessarily in charge of a world that's only been around for a few thousand years. And that, I think, seems to be the view of some, those scientists who want to maintain that you can have an open mind on the question.
Yeah.
It's typically a minimal conception of God that they're appealing to.
Yeah, so
shorn of all the attributes that make it easy to attach with science, or easy to see an internal logical problem.
So the problem of evil is one internal logical problem. Of course, the other internal logical problem is the doctrine of the Trinity, which also seems like it's, forget about incompatible religion. These people think that something can be three and one at the same time. So how does, as I said, if you believe three impossible things before breakfast, So, of course, some people have denied the doctrine of the Trinity because they couldn't see how to solve that problem, including Isaac Newton, who gets called a deist rather than a theist, because there was this heresy in the 17th century that said that that Jesus wasn't God, was not identical with God. Now, I suppose this brings us to the problem of what exactly we mean by God, and more broadly what exactly we mean by religion. And as I said, the traditional conception is of the Christian theological tradition is God is a being who's perfectly good, perfectly knowing, and perfectly powerful. But presumably you could still believe in God even if you denied one or other of those attributes, as we've just been talking about. What exactly religion is, I think, is an even more difficult question, because you'll get some people who say that they believe in God but they're not religious. People associate religion with a set of cultural practices, might have nothing to do with an intellectual belief or not. I think quite a lot of people who go to church and stuff just do it because that's what everyone around them does, and they like being part of all of that, and they don't particularly believe in it, they just do it. And so you could say they're fully religious because they're going to go along with all of that stuff, but lack the kind of doxastic bit. There's quite a common attitude among Jewish thinkers, including the late Peter Lipton, whose wife was a rabbi and who went to synagogue all the time, and yet who professed he didn't believe in God. So that's an extra complication. I suppose I am arguing for the merely logical point, right? And so Samir is right that, Samir might say, well, I'm not defending anything very interesting, and that may be true. I'm defending something like the bare logical compatibility of believing in some kind of supernatural being with some of these properties with the existence of science as we know it. And you might think, well, that's just not terribly interesting, because especially those of you who've done philosophy have learned that there are all sorts of bare logical possibilities that we don't care about at all, right? I might have come into existence 5 minutes ago with all my memories. We might all have only just come into existence 5 minutes ago, right? That's logically compatible with the evidence we've got now, right? But we dismiss it as a hypothesis. So the mere logical availability of a hypothesis and any reason to take it seriously, to be interested in it, to give it discussion or whatever, I think that's true. But of course, the reason why people discuss the religious hypothesis is because unlike the hypothesis that the Earth came into existence 5 minutes ago, or the hypothesis that we're brains in vats or whatever, for people who are religious, and I should say, by the way, that I'm not religious, don't believe in God, and I'm engaging in this for the purposes of argument as much as anything else. I don't have a theological axe to grind here. You might say, yeah, for religious people, the reason why they talk about this hypothesis and take it seriously is because it's one that really makes a real difference to their lives. It seems to be terribly important to them. And so part of what I think people object to in the kind of line that Dawkins and others take is not merely that it's pragmatically not a very good way to get people on your side or argue with them, but there's some kind of supreme intellectual arrogance involved in a kind of absolute and unequivocal dismissal of whole traditions of thought and whole areas of human experience that other people claim mean a great deal to them, when lots of those other people are not obviously crazy or irrational or stupid. Right? So that's a reason to, not to be completely dismissive of the hypothesis that God exists in the way that we're dismissive of the hypothesis that the Earth's been around for 5 minutes and we were all created 5 minutes ago. That the latter hypothesis plays no role in any of our lives, and there's no great intellectual tradition associated with it. The hypothesis of the existence of God does play a role in lots of people's lives, and so somehow it seems like we have to take a supremely kind of condescending and patronising and superior attitude to those people in order to say that science has told us that God can't exist.
Yeah, I'll make two remarks about that. Okay, you say, James, that the hypothesis that God exists, say, is very different from the hypothesis that the sceptical hypothesis that we're all dreaming or we all came into existence 5 minutes ago with our memory traces intact, except of the sort of sceptical fantasy we discuss in the philosophy classroom. But it strikes me that, epistemologically, you could argue they're on a par. There's no reason to believe any of them. There's as much reason to believe the one as the other. Right. And you're right, certainly, that the one plays a major role in people's lives all around the world. But that doesn't, it doesn't follow from that with our epistemologist's hat on, if we pose the question, is there any more reason to believe that? Put it another, maybe a less tendentious way to put it is this. Is there any more reason to believe in God than there is in Santa Claus? Well, I said, no, not really, no. That would be my answer to that. So I would say epistemologically they're on a par. Now the one obviously is just a belief that we humour our kids with until they're about 10 or 12 or something. And the other plays a major organising role for a large portion of the world's life, or at least as part of a body of doctrine and associated cultural practices that does that. But that doesn't prevent me from saying epistemologically they're on a par. You've got as much reason to believe the one as the other.
Okay, good. So what I say about that is that the people who believed in God claim they've got an extra reason. And that reason isn't one that we can have any access to or know anything about. But they claim that they had personal experience of God, or some kind of personal experience that makes them believe in God, some kind of religious experience or experience of faith. And we don't find people claiming to have that kind of personal experience of Santa Claus.
I mean, here I think this touches on what's a very interesting observation that has recently been made by a number of people who do what they call the cognitive science of religion. And they're interested in the question, people here in the psychology department, incidentally, quite big on that. They're interested in the question, why it is that the human mind seems so favourably disposed towards religious belief. What features of why is that? And can you say anything interesting about that? And one of their starting observations, I think, is a very telling point, where they say it's a fact that knowledge of science, and indeed sometimes quite sophisticated knowledge of it, knowledge of how the world works, doesn't tend to diminish religious conviction very much. Right. So they go to study parts of the world where they've come into contact with Western science fairly recently. And they pretty quickly, latch onto it and latch onto base stuff like antibiotics and all the very basic products of science and the associated technology. But it seems to coexist quite easily with people's religious beliefs. I mean, I think that's perhaps not so true in Britain, but that's certainly true in other parts of the world, say in the States. That really is true, that the one doesn't tend to displace the other. By contrast, usually we're fairly attentive to, we do engage in quite a fair scrutiny of our beliefs to see how well they hang together. We tend not to believe things that clash, ordinarily. So the suggestion then is that there's a kind of religion module in our brain which is encapsulated with respect to the factual information that we've got. Which has the result that when you learn more factual information, it doesn't tend to diminish what's in the religion module. I mean, obviously that's a caricature, and that's a simplified model of how it might be. And in some people that's not true. In some people it does tend to do that. But the suggestion is that some sort of cognitive psychological model like that might explain the striking fact that exposure to Western science and in learning a lot about it, both in the West and in the East, doesn't tend to diminish religious conviction in the way that you'd think it should, if people were sort of fully rational, integrated agents.
And that's all the assumption that there is an incompatibility.
It is, that's all obviously all the assumption that there is an incompatibility.
Because the other explanation for it would be that the reason this can happen is because they're not actually incompatible.
Yeah, I mean, so then we're back to the argument, the line of argument I find really a stretch, personally, which is to say, they're perfectly compatible when you realise that the Bible's just this kind of nice metaphor for something else. I mean, I don't think anyone thought of saying that until they realised that it clashed with science, right? I tend to think of that as a last-ditch measure. But James is absolutely right, that this idea of a religion module and a factual information module with only limited flow of information or information integration between them is all, designed to explain something that cries out for explanation only on the assumption that religion and science do conflict.
Okay, so another thing I want to bring up, which some of these religious people do, is kind of an objection to Samir. I'm not sure I think it's right, but I think it's challenging and needs to be kind of on the table. Which is to say, you're right that we don't have any reason to believe in God. But we don't have any reason to believe anything. And the reason we don't have reason to believe anything is because let's say, here's an example, all our reasoning about matters of fact, taking the first year course, then you're paraphrasing Hume, all our reasoning about matters of fact relies upon induction, because it all relies upon reasoning about cause and effect. And reasoning about cause and effect presupposes the uniformity of nature. And the uniformity of nature is something we take as an axiom. It's not something that we can have any reason to believe, because it's exactly the kind of thing that we can't get a reason to believe, independently of believing it to start with. And so, you could take the kind of line in epistemology where you say, well, look, if I just found myself, you know, epistemologically or virginal, right? Virginal, right? So I've just got an empty set of beliefs. I don't believe anything, I don't disbelieve anything. Right? And then you tell me, and now I'm going to give you all the evidence, whatever these sciencey people like Samir thinks the evidence is. I'm going into character slightly here, right? Then what will you end up believing? Right? Will all that evidence determine what your beliefs should be? And their claim is, no, it won't. The evidence alone will just determine that you believe the evidence. And whatever logically follows from the evidence. But let's just say that's part of the evidence. We just take, by the evidence, we just mean the logical closure of the evidence. Okay, so if it's true that this metal expanded when heated and that metal expanded when heated, then the conjunction is also true. Okay, and nothing more. Okay, so there I am, I don't believe anything, you give me the evidence, and now what do I believe? I just believe what's logically entailed by the evidence. And that is hardly anything of what Samir, or I, or you believe. It certainly doesn't include that, you know, the universe is 12 billion years old, or that, you know, what will happen in the future to the universe, or whatever. Right? Because it certainly doesn't entail that next time he eats a piece of bread it will be nourishing. So in order to, and this is something that, I mean, I don't like this kind of argument, but I raise it because if you want to combat these people, this is the kind of thing they say, they'll say, look, you know, science can't start from nowhere. Science, in a sense, relies upon faith too, right? Or at least on some kind of metaphysics. But arguably, the metaphysics that we have for science is one we got from its religiously inspired origins, right? That God set up the universe with laws of nature in a way that would be rationally intelligible to us. Right? What we've got is we've got that metaphysics, but no God. Okay? So arguably it's worse than it was if we had God, because now we have no explanation at all for what on earth laws of nature are, and whether they govern or not, as people seem to think they do, what that could mean, and why on earth we should believe in induction, believe that the universe is intelligible to us, believe that things will keep going the way we expect them to, and so on. And then the claim is, yeah, so you can put in some extra premises that, yeah, there's in, you know, the world's, nature's more or less uniform, or something along those lines. There are causal laws and regularities that hold at all space-time points, or whatever you want. You can put that stuff in, but you'll be putting it in because it's a kind of transcendental presupposition of you having any knowledge, not because you've got evidence for it. And so the religious person can say, we're not really any worse off. You go beyond the evidence in that particular way, and we go beyond the evidence in another way, but we're all going beyond the evidence. There's no question here of anybody believing only what the evidence says.
Yeah, I mean, so what James is alluding to here, of course, you know, scepticism. That's the view that says you can't really know anything at all. And what to say about that? I mean, there's no debates about what to say in response to scepticism go on in epistemology and philosophy of science, and there's not really any particularly good answer. But I don't see that as grist to the mill of either the theist or of the person arguing that science and religion don't in fact conflict. And indicative of that is the following response that you might give to a line of argument that's being used by proponents of creationism and intelligent design. You know, so faced with the theory of evolution, then their favourite response to that is to say, oh, but look, I mean, you know, that refers to what happened, you know, how long, many, many millions of years ago, and that's just a theory. So, you know, you've got your evidence now, fossils, you know, look at DNA, modern genetics, look at various other things that evolutionists will say supports their view, and the creationists respond by saying, well, it's just a theory. They say it may be a good one by the standards of science, but the fact remains, it's just a theory. And so we've got our theory too. You know, God made the earth and made the fossils, put the fossils there to trick humans into believing in science. Right. Now, of course, that has the logical structure, exactly the sort of problem James was talking about. You've got the evidence, and you've got two alternative theories that can purport to explain it. You know, one, what modern science tells us roughly about the world, and the other, you know, the claim that you know, God made it all, and put the fossils there to trick us. And what to say about it? Well, I would say one thing in response to that is that it involves a very selective form of skepticism, and it's an unmotivated selection, right? And that there's no more reason to say that than there is to say, well, look, you know, gravity is just a theory. Or it's just a theory that unsupported objects tend to fall towards the Earth. Or that it's just a theory, you know, to talk about plate tectonics, or the theory of continental drift, or it's just a theory, you know, to talk about something in psychology, or to say the periodic table of the elements. Well, that's just a theory. You know, what do you actually see? You see, you know, you put white powder into the Bunsen burner and then you tip something else in. That's what you see, and you've constructed this theory to explain it. Periodic table of the elements. But of course, that's scientific fact if ever there was, right? So the point is not to dismiss the skeptical challenge when raised in the context of epistemology, right? But to emphasize that those proponents of creationism who try and argue that evolution is, you know, Darwinian evolution is just a theory, might as well say that about anything. And if they mean that on a point of logic, the beliefs in question logically go beyond the evidence available for them, that's indisputable. See, because all hypotheses in science are general in form, right? And obviously our evidence is not. You know, it's particularly, it's localized to the observations we've made in the here and now, you know, and yet on the basis of that we form expansive generalizations and overarching worldviews. So there is a gap, clearly, between evidence and theory. And there are various things you can say about what makes it rational to entertain the scientific theories we do, given their underdetermination by the evidence. But none of that, I say, makes it sensible to be selectively skeptical towards the bits of science that you don't like because they clash with religion. If you follow the logic through, you should just be skeptical about the whole damn lot, and probably about everything, about everyday knowledge too. You're Descartes, back in Descartes and Meditations 1. And admittedly, it's a non-trivial sort of philosophical problem what to say about that. But the thing about skepticism you have to remember is that we discuss it in philosophy not because we think it might be true, right? But because we think of it as a useful benchmark against which to test theories of knowledge. So take the theory of knowledge, for example, which says, look, all of knowledge must be deduced from your basic evidence. You should only believe what can be deduced from your evidence in the literal sense of deduction. You're familiar with from your first year logic, right? Take that theory of knowledge, well, that can't be right, right? Because that means we know virtually nothing about the world, right? At least, and exactly what we know depends on exactly what you count as our evidence. But certainly our evidence isn't going to include things about what's going to happen in the future, what happened in the remote past, or in parts of the solar system, the universe that we haven't observed. Right. So if you take literally that theory of knowledge, the only things you can know are what you can deduce from your evidential base, then on any plausible construal of what your evidential base is, you're going to end up with the conclusion that you know nothing. The skeptic very well know very little. Most of what you take yourself to know, you don't. And it's not that we think that that's true. The sort of best, this kind of mature philosophical response to that is to say, well, then that's a reductio ad absurdum of the theory of knowledge in question. And that's the point and the philosophical interest of skepticism. Not that we really entertain skeptical doubts or skeptical hypotheses, but that we observe that certain theories about knowledge, about evidence, certain epistemological views, give rise to skepticism, and then we say, that means that those views must be wrong. So we engage with skepticism because we use that as, we think of it as a useful test case or benchmark for assessing theories of knowledge, not because we really think it might be true.
Okay, so notice the way Samir associated what I said with a creation scientist who denied evolution. Right? I did not suggest that we should believe in evolution. I did not propound that as a reasonable view. I did not advocate skepticism. I'm imagining someone who says, yeah, I believe in evolution, I believe in everything that science tells me, but just as in doing that, I go beyond what's logically entailed in by the evidence, I also go beyond what's logically entailed by the evidence to believe in God.
Yeah.
Right? But not in a way that conflicts with anything I believe in my everyday life or in science. So I'm not relying upon the idea that evolution is just a theory or anything like it. Right? I'm simply pointing out that, as Samir said, a theory of knowledge that says that the only thing you can know or justifiably believe is what's entailed by the evidence is crazy. Therefore, the fact that the evidence doesn't entail I should believe in God isn't a problem for belief in God.
Yeah. So at this point, the natural thing to do is to say, well, clearly then there must be principles of evidential support that go beyond deductive logic, right? So there must be principles, which roughly tell you when, on the basis of given evidence, you can reasonably believe something. It's a long and difficult philosophical task of trying to say what those principles are, but we take it that there have got to be those, because otherwise we really are in the skeptical predicament. If all we've got to go on is current observation plus deductive logic, then we can't get there. That's not enough. So clearly we need some other principles. The study of these is sometimes called inductive logic in a very broad sense. Principles of non-deductive reasoning, rational responding to evidence in a non-deductive form. And presumably there are such principles, right? And presumably, when we can say exactly what they are, we'll see immediately that they show that the God hypothesis has got no evidential support at all.
Presumably.
Yeah. And
so that's a presumption of your reasoning.
Yeah, well, that's what we must think.
And that's not an argument for it, because it's a presumption of your reasoning. But let me just make another point here. That we are arguing at cross purposes, because you seem to be arguing. I mean, there seems to be two things. First of all, I want to argue that justified belief in science does not entail not believing in God, or that the scientific beliefs indeed conflict with the existence of God. That's one point. But the second point is, Samir seems to be assuming that if I'm to believe in God, I have to be justified in believing in God. I have some kind of evidence. It has to be based on some kind of principle of reasoning. But suppose I don't think that. Suppose I don't think that what people believe should be all and only what they're justified in believing. Suppose I think that there are areas of option, right, where no justification can be given, but where no justification is required for me to believe it. So just as I believe that nature's uniform, and I can't give a justification for that, but I'm allowed to believe it. So I'm imagining a religious person who A, doesn't believe anything in religious doctrine that conflicts with science, so they just don't think they operate in the same domain. They don't believe in the natural history, don't believe in evolution, they're not a creationist. Okay? But they also just add to everything else they belief in God. And if you say to them, do you think that your belief in God passes a kind of rational persuasion test, such that anybody else who had your evidence should also believe in God? They say, no, don't think that at all.
Yeah.
Don't see why anyone else should believe in God. Don't really know why I believe in God. I just believe in it. Now, what Samir needs to establish to argue against that is that not merely that Samir needs to argue that belief is the kind of thing such that if you haven't got a good reason to believe something, you shouldn't believe it. Whereas I'm assuming that if you haven't got a good reason not to believe something, you're allowed to believe it.
Well, I mean, there are a number of issues getting run together here. I mean, I would say that person who James envisages, who strips away from, orthodox religious doctrine, all the bits that clash with science, so just and end up ends up left with just something as simple and minimal as God exists. There is a God. Which perhaps could be spelled out, presumably could be spelled out in a way that doesn't clash.
Well, there might be in a bit more. There might be that believers' religious experience is connected to the existence of God.
Well, they spell it out in such a way that there doesn't seem to be an overt logical incompatibility between that and science. And then they say, now I just believe the whole lot. I believe what science tells me, but I just append onto it this additional bit, God exists, and perhaps some other little spiel as well. But certainly not enough to generate a logically inconsistent belief set. And then they say, well, what am I doing wrong? I say they're violating an obvious and simple canon of rational belief, right? Which is that if there's a logically simpler thing that you can believe that explains exactly the same evidence, what's sometimes called Occam's razor, you don't multiply entities beyond necessity, as Occam put it, right? But they've got their scientific beliefs, and that they explain a huge lot of evidence, huge lot of data about the world. That's the reason for believing them. But they append onto that something that makes no empirical difference, right? And which could never be subject to empirical tests. And they say, in addition to all of that, I believe this other thing. So they believe something much logically stronger than they need to in order to explain and make sense of the world around them, right? And I say they're guilty of violating a fairly clear principle of inductive logic or principle of canon of rational belief. But another issue James raises, though, and I think of this as an orthogonal one, is the question of whether belief, as some people have it, is a notion. What's the slogan? So is it a question of permission or is it a question of obligation? Right. So it's useful here to follow the American philosopher Van Frassen,
Dutch philosopher, I think you'd say.
Dutch philosopher.
Dutch Canadian.
In making an analogy with the contrast between Prussian and English law. Apparently in Prussian law, right, then everything is forbidden, right, except the things that are expressly permitted. Right, so the default is you're not allowed to do anything except these things that you can. And in English law it's the other way, everything's assumed permitted except the things that are expressly forbidden. And Van Frassen poses the nice question, is belief deontological or not? I mean, is it like the Prussian or the English system? Is it that you're not allowed to believe anything except the things you've got grounds for believing, or is it rather you can believe whatever you like except the things your evidence rules out? And he wants to argue for the latter view, not surprisingly, because he's religious, right? And in fact, he's one of those unusual characters who combines, science and religion. So he wants to argue precisely that what James was suggesting, that you can rationally believe anything that isn't rationally forbidden. But even if you accept that view, I myself think that view doesn't really correspond with the way we operate with the notion of rational belief ordinarily. If I said to you, look, I believe in a tooth fairy, you say, well, why? I say, look, it's just one of those beliefs I've got. It's not rationally forbidden. It's permissible. Well, a lot of things are permissible. But then you have to say, well, but why that, not that? So I think that ordinarily when you profess to have a belief, you immediately invite the question, but why do you think that? If someone says to you, look, I believe that there's no point going to the lecture today because it's cancelled, because I think it's going to be cancelled. There's no point walking over across town because it's cancelled. And then you say, well, why? Yeah, but why? Why do you believe that? You say, well, it's not forbidden. That's not the way we operate. I mean, normally, if people profess to have beliefs, then you do assume, and they take themselves to be, putting themselves in a dialectical position where they can offer grounds for their beliefs. So I think of this move that James is alluding to, I'm not accusing James of holding the view himself, as a bit of a desperate one, really, of saying we operate with this kind of permissive notion of belief according to which it's legitimate to believe things you've got no evidence for at all.
Okay, so what I was saying about that is, of course, the reason why, in Samir's example that he just used, the reason why it's a problem is because you've got loads of reasons to believe the lecture is on, right? And now this person is telling you it isn't on, so there's a conflict. So that's why they owe you an answer. But imagine in the first place that you believe the lecture is on, and they believe it isn't on, and neither have you got any evidence either way. That's more analogous to this situation. So the problem for the person who says, oh, the lecture won't be on, I believe it's cancelled, and you say, why? And they say, oh, I just think that, is they then have to explain, well, how come it's in the timetable? How come everyone else believes it's happening? Blah, 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 blah. It was on last week, or whatever. Right? So, of course, you know, likewise with the tooth fairy, I mean, it's sort of like, okay, you believe in the tooth fairy, but I actually, you know that I put the coin under my child's pillow. So, you know, we can't both have done it. So am I the tooth fairy or what, right? So there's a conflict. Whereas the religion case, I mean, the point is really supposed to be, this is a genuine case of a belief that's supererogatory, that goes beyond everything. And therefore, there's just no question of an incompatibility arising. By the way, I would just say, I mean, it is true that Manfredson is religious, but that doctrine about voluntarism and epistemology is believed by Richard Pettigrew, for example, who isn't religious. So it's not as if that view in epistemology is some kind of bizarre outlying position that's only seized upon by religious people desperate to say anything to shore up their view. It's quite a well-known and reasonable position in probabilistic epistemology to say, well, actually, there's no formula for telling you what you should believe given a given body of evidence. There's only a negative constraint from that evidence. There are lots of compatible, some of you may be doing this course, right? So you'll find out more about this than I do. Richard's teaching probability and rationality this term. There are lots of belief functions that are compatible with the evidence that also satisfy the probability calculus.
Yeah, but that just shows that there must be constraints beyond that. Right, because otherwise, I mean, you can respond to that by saying, oh, well, then there are no constraints beyond that, so we have this bizarre voluntarist epistemology.
Yeah.
Or you can respond to that by saying, well, clearly, compatibility with the laws of probability is necessary, but not sufficient condition of rationality. I mean,
okay, but
that's sort of a standard thing to say.
But we don't have, so far, we don't have agreed upon the set of conditions.
We don't.
So, therefore, it's at least on the table.
But I think people who make that argument just cleave to one particular model of rationality that they like, because it has attractive formal properties. It's very clear. And then wheel in this business, right? Not that it's really very plausible.
Whereas the alternative is to be really sure that whatever the model of rationality you're going to have will have to have the feature that it doesn't allow for voluntarism, whilst not being sure what that model is.
Well, I mean, that it doesn't allow you... I mean, it's just really the whole issue of skepticism again. I mean, do you... as I see it, and we're never in the market for the skeptical conclusion. We treat the skeptical conclusion as just a demonstration that we made of one of our premises was wrong, if we reasoned correctly to it. Those of you who are going to be in my lecture tomorrow will hear more about this then. I mean, we have touched on two other topics that perhaps we should just say a word about before kind of throwing it open for questions. I mean, one is the issue of epistemic versus pragmatic reasons for belief. So it's a distinction we make in philosophy between a reason you might have for a belief in the epistemic sense, which means something that gives you good grounds for holding the belief, and a reason that you might have for a belief in a pragmatic sense, in that good things would accrue to you if you held that belief. Right. Now this presumes that to some extent what you believe is within your voluntary control, which incidentally is not what voluntarism means, as James was using it. So, I mean, put it this way, imagine this, imagine if someone's held a gun to your head and said, look, I'll shoot you unless you believe in God. Now suppose that it was within your rational control, or shoot you unless you believe in the tooth fairy. Now suppose it was within your control whether you could believe that or not. Now on my view of the matter, that isn't really within your control. I don't think I could obey that order if my life depended on it. Right. But many philosophers think you can, right, obey that order. You can alter your beliefs kind of at will. But even then, that's clearly just a pragmatic reason for belief. Even if I could believe that believe in the tooth fairy and thereby save my life, if someone's put a gun to my head, right? That clearly would be a pragmatic reason for doing so. good things would accrue to me if I did, but it wouldn't be an epistemic reason for holding that belief. Right. And I would still firmly be of the view that I've got no rational grounds for holding that belief, and every rational ground for disbelieving it, and so I wouldn't hold it. That I shouldn't hold it. But nonetheless, in another sense of should, I clearly should, because that way I'll survive. And I think that in debates about the compatibility of science and religion, and whether you can merge the two and so on, there tends to be a bit of slippage between the epistemic and the pragmatic senses of rationality.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And so people sometimes seem to, make the argument that belief is great for you psychologically, as I mentioned earlier. There's evidence that that's the case. That it's good for, helps get society on an even keel if people believe in God. You may or may not agree with that. And it has other sort of benefits, but most of those could be pragmatic grounds for belief, not epistemic grounds. Although I should say finally that there are what I would regard as highly maverick philosophers who maintain that epistemic pragmatic distinction can't and doesn't in fact hold water and collapses ultimately, but let's not go there for the moment. There are a lot of other topics we could have talked about. We didn't talk much about intelligent design, the fine-tuning argument, the cosmological
Those are arguments for the existence of God.
Yeah.
Well, we're talking about arguments against the existence.
Yeah, but maybe some of the audience wanted to hear our views about
maybe
intelligent design and Darwinism, that sort of stuff.
But
this could have gone in a lot of different ways.
I want to say one more thing. We're not saying the last word, but you have the first word, so it's only one.
Fair enough.
I just want to say one more thing, but I don't think I'm going to be able to say this without Samir having a response.
Oh, then I'll have the last word.
Yeah, you have the last word. So, and this is just that. Let's think about different beliefs that we have that perhaps everything that we just said about religious belief would carry over to. So, suppose I believe that objectively, mind independently, regardless of what people think, regardless of cultural difference, some parodic example of what's wrong really is wrong. Okay? So, the least contentious example I can think of is recreational torture of children is wrong. I mean, I think recreational torture of anybody, but kind of especially children or something. Right? So, recreational torture is wrong. Now, ask yourself what could count as evidence for that. I mean, people believe it, okay, but people have, whole cultures have believed all sorts of crazy stuff. And the mere fact that people believe it can't be evidence for it. And lots of people will tell you that that's a kind of really mysterious, weird kind of fact, which if you believe it, commits you to the existence of mind-independent, weird kind of values or moral laws or whatever. Right? And my point is simply, I'm not convinced that belief in, if we were to buy what Samir was saying, then I'm not convinced that we should believe, given what he says, that recreational torture is wrong. I can't see that it's going to be compelled by any canons of inference. So I'm going to go away with Samir's epistemology. I'm going to go away thinking, yeah, I just kind of believe that recreational torture is wrong because that's what everyone else around me believes, and it's kind of good for society if I believe that, and all these things that we said might be true of religious belief. But that if we're being strictly epistemological and properly philosophical, I really have no grounds to believe it at all. And what's more, it doesn't really make any sense. It's like the God hypothesis. Right? So if you're going to be as strict and thoroughgoing about what it is to be a properly rational person who bases what they believe on the evidence, then I think you're going to have a lot more, there's going to be a lot more that's problematic about what you believe than belief in God, if you happen to believe in God. Now Samir actually, I think, does think that the proposition, well, you have an error theory of that? Or recreational torture is wrong. Order of
well, I mean, I
expressivist
don't
or
get
something.
into ethics personally.
But you don't believe it's true, do you? Whatever the case, you don't believe it's true.
Well, not in the same sense that it's true that that's a table, you know.
Right.
But anyway, I mean, that's another whole big can of worms. Right? We could sit here all night discussing that without getting anywhere. So maybe we should throw it over the floor. Anyone got any questions, or even topics that you'd like to, we didn't really touch on, or perhaps tangentially that you'd like to hear more about, or... Yeah.
I, in these kind of debates, I've been wondering how different the debate would be if the concept of God was a bit more fluid. So often the concept of God is quite obviously a kind of a figure which is independent of people, but that's not often, or not always the case when people even think themselves religious. God might be something that is possibly something that's more about conscious experience and sort of about experience and how people say that you wouldn't know what God is because it's based on my experience, but to them God isn't even, it's not even just that you're experiencing something outside of you, it's that within your experience you've got this thing which might be called God, and also I guess within that is how what is being signified by the word God, and how language might be limiting the conversation.
Right, no, I mean, those are good questions. I mean, I was taking it that we take a sort of surface grammar at face value, both which also corresponds, I think, with kind of standard monotheism, that we've got at person, the sort of guy in the sky with a beard, and we've got a proper noun, God, that picks him out. So so logically, if I say God exists, it's like saying Napoleon existed or something. As opposed to Santa Claus, who doesn't. So semantically, we've just got a proper name rather, picking out an individual who's been introduced to us by description in various biblical and religious texts, and who seems to be modelled on a person. Now, I would say that the sort of semantical aspects of worrying about the grammatical form and so on are perhaps not as important as the other aspect of your question, which is, can you have a notion of God that doesn't model it on a human or person at all? And that I think is an interesting question. And I don't know a huge lot about world religions, but it might be that that's very much a sort of monotheistic. That's Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and maybe other world religions have a notion of, or the nearest thing they have to a notion of God doesn't really fit that template at all.
There's a great discussion there's a great argument in India in the Middle Ages or later between Buddhists and monotheists, and there it's completely outside of the Judaic tradition. And I think their definition is just something like supreme being that created the universe or whatever. So I think it's not the crucial idea, I suppose, was that the idea of we were arguing about the existence of God or whether God's compatible with science, but not in a kind of completely watered down sense. So I think we're quite broad about what God could mean, right? Could mean that he has the traditional properties of omnipotence, perfect benevolence, and omniscience. Could be that he's got some, but not all of those. Could be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Moses. Could be the God of Plato, right? Because Plato's a monotheist who knows nothing about Christianity or Judaism, right? But he still ends up believing in some kind of monotheism. Socrates likewise. What we're ruling out is a definition of God where it becomes so, no one's going to argue that that doesn't exist. So kind of, caricature of Church of England, wishy-washy, God is the warm feeling you get inside when you do something nice for someone, right? I mean, we're ruling out anything that's as weak as that.
But why is that? That people subscribe to that as religion?
Oh, because I don't think Samir would want to argue that anything, I mean, even prima facie, science was incompatible with that. Right? With feeling good, yeah. Or having a or the fact that people have a generalised experience of benevolence sometimes, or something.
Yeah, right? or maybe you mean sort of some kind of otherworldly thing or something like that. Because some people will say when they're pushed on it and kind of question it, they'll say, look, I'm not religious in the sense of believing in God, but I do believe that there's something kind of spiritual out there that transcends.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I get the feeling that things are really weird. But we can't be arguing about anything as weak as that.
Yeah, I mean, so I suppose we were, from one perspective, maybe being a bit naive in sort of cleaving to something like the, the sort of this kind of guy up in the sky with a beard. Because I think the danger is, I mean, as James is saying, if you allow it to be watered down too much, so it doesn't even putatively have to be a referring term, right, like a proper name, then it becomes, a little too easy to do the reconciliation of the science and the religion.
But I don't see where that's a problem.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting how people who don't believe in God, and like at some point I was very strongly atheist when I was growing up, and I thought God couldn't exist, seem to have a very clear idea of what God is, or at least some idea of what makes up God. Okay, maybe you don't know exactly what they're talking about by God, but you have some sort of grounding in what is God is. But a lot of religious people don't seem to think that they really know what God is. In fact, it's part of theology, a big tradition in theology, that you can't know what God is.
That's right.
So,
that's right.
I mean, this leads to sort of interesting perspective when you think, okay, so these people who believe in God don't really know what God is. They admit that they don't know what God is. So then what can this belief in God be? You believe in something which you don't know what it is. And I think maybe, this is more speculative, but what we're talking about, maybe that it's sort of allowing for a different way of looking at things, to the scientific way of looking at things. And through believing that there's something else, I mean, that's very general, like you were saying, but it allows for a different perspective, maybe.
But I certainly think you can grant that there are kind of dimensions of human existence that aren't usefully illuminated by science, right? Like the realm of the arts and music and literature, and those sorts of realms that you can argue involve a kind of different sensibility altogether. And I would agree with that very strongly. But I would also point out that that's because, they don't make cognitive claims, if you like. They don't advance claims that purport to be true, really. But I think it's a good question, and when you say, is it really, how can they have those beliefs if they don't even know what it is that they believe in? I think here, and there is an interesting issue about whether the sense of belief at work when people say they believe in God is really the kind of orthodox, is really sort of the standard sense of belief that we operate with the rest of the time. And this ties in part with the thing, the cognitive science of religion argument I was making, which says, you've got religious faith in that box, and you've got factual bits in this box, factual information in this box, and they don't really integrate. In that you could argue, what is the notion of belief? The notion of belief is intimately bound up with action, ordinarily. And some philosophers, indeed, so-called functionalists in philosophy of mind, will argue for a very tight link ultimately between belief and action. Right? In that ordinarily, if you believe something, then that should, inform along with certain assumptions about what you want to achieve. That's going to inform your choices, how you behave. Right? Now you could say, well, by that yardstick, belief in God does, because clearly it informs people's decisions about whether to go into a church or not. And that's true-ish, but I still think there's a sense, I can't articulate this particularly clearly, there's a sense in which, in a way, it's not the real deal, belief in God. In that people aren't really often prepared to genuinely put their money where their mouth is. And even believers in the omnipotence of God, even biblical literalists, they still go to the doctor, for an aspirin, or if they get cancer, they know where to go. They don't go and try and get cured, usually, by their religious healer. So that makes me think that, in one sense, this is less than the real thing. This is a watered-down version of belief, in that it's not giving rise to action systematically enough. Yeah?
Well, on that point, Buddhism is quite a good example of where that is actually done, in that they would ignore medicine and engage in sort of meditation, which gives them this feeling of accessing God, and they experience, a type of health.
So that's a really weird form of Buddhism, because Buddhism is usually defined by denial of the existence of God.
No, I'm talking about
Buddhism is incompatible with
I'm
monotheism.
talking about a type of spirituality which transcends science in that sense.
Okay, but it's not Buddhism, right?
Well, okay, it's
whatever.
not Buddhism. Yeah. But the point is that
that's true. Buddhists, if they don't take medicine.
yeah, well,
It's not true of all Buddhists.
I think
I know what you mean, and there are a lot of cases in which meditators go off and they don't take medicine.
But
But there are also
see,
cases
modern
where
medicine
people
doesn't
go
always
to-
work that well. Maybe they're not. So on, but if they're hungry, they eat food.
Sorry, but I'm at a loss of why we should think that religious people wouldn't take medicine or eat food if they were properly committed.
Well, no. If you believe that prayer could heal, people. I'm saying you get people who purport to believe that, right? The healing power of prayer, by the fact they take modern pharmaceuticals.
Oh, I see.
Right, and I'm saying that makes me wonder whether I wouldn't want to say they're being disingenuous or dishonest, but I might. But another view you could take of it is to say, look, it's not really belief in exactly the same sense. It doesn't play the same functional role. Belief in the healing power of prayer doesn't play the same sort of functional role in someone's.
But that's totally. That's not part of the core. It's not part of the core of religion that you believe that the only way to cure illness is by prayer or anything like that. The core is just there is some supernatural being.
Yeah. Right.
So,
now I was touching on this idea, trying to articulate this idea that aspects of religious belief, although we describe them, and they are described by most people as involving the notion of belief.
As behaviour.
Believing.
I suppose this
Doesn't give
informs
rise to
their ethical
behaviour.
behaviour, and it informs how they treat other people, and it
Mm,
informs
no,
how they think about their own lives.
It's not a clear-cut point.
Yeah. Because that stuff about how religious belief is correlated with pro-sociality suggests that it does meet the functionalist condition of being a because it affects people's behaviour.
Well, it certainly seems to affect people's behaviour, yeah. Not to me, though. I think not with quite the degree of systematicity that you would want for it to be, the real deal.
Yeah.
But surely the problem with most religions is that they do make existential claims. And so, if you are a Christian, and then you say, okay, well, I believe in evolution, but I still believe in God. If you are a Christian, you must surely believe that Jesus is the Son of God. That is implicit in the religion. And so...
Well, it's explicit in the religion.
Yeah.
And unless you're Newton, who...
So then surely you're saying that you are making an existential claim which will, therefore, contradict science. So you can't be... Surely, I don't see how you can be a Christian just taking the ethical values, but then still believing in science.
Well, James is arguing
an argument. I've argued that it doesn't
the base
contradict science.
existential
Nothing in
claim.
science that says Jesus is the Son of God.
Yeah, but then you...
Yeah, but there is something in science that says you
defining
can't
God.
have virgin births, right? But I mean, I think the point is here that if James was operating with a weak enough notion of sort of minimal core commitment, the core existential commitment, according to which that's compatible logically with everything you get in a physics book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, otherwise we wouldn't even have got to the ground having a debate about it. I mean, bearing in mind that I don't actually believe in God or this stuff. I mean, I would be pretty hard pressed to come here and argue that I don't care what science says, you know, there was a virgin birth and whatever.
Question over there?
Yeah. So, like, one of the last points you made was that, say, the resurrection of Jesus doesn't conflict with science because we don't have any kind of item of scientific knowledge that directly conflicts with the kind of biblical accounts of the resurrection of Jesus. But would you not kind of in a broader sense count that as conflicting with science if you reasoned that it's anti-scientific to believe something that can't be derived from, that isn't derived from reason or from evidence? So in a kind of broader sense, if something goes against the scientific method of not believing in something before you have sufficient evidence, doesn't that constitute conflicting with science, even if you don't have an item of knowledge that it directly contradicts?
Well, yeah, we spent quite a lot of time on that. I mean, I said that I'm not convinced that it is part of science that you shouldn't believe anything unless you have evidence for it, on the grounds that science can't even get going without something like belief in induction, which you can't have any independent evidence for. But in any case, I mean, unsurprisingly, I was really arguing for, or talking about what often gets called the God of the philosophers versus the God of Abraham, Isaac and Moses, or whoever it is. So I think you're on a lot dodgier ground, and I try to argue the weakest possible thing, right? So I think you're on a lot dodgier ground as soon as you start getting into specifics, like Jesus was raised from the dead, Jesus performed miracles. I mean, clearly there is a kind of incompatibility there. I mean, if science says that virgin birth can't happen and physically impossible, then that is a conflict. So, you know, the God of the philosophers is the God that Socrates and Plato argue their way to. That's not the same as the God of the Bible. And so I was really trying to defend a kind of logically minimal, compatibility, logically minimal concept of God being compatible with science. But it gets more tricky if you start taking specific Christian doctrines like the virgin birth, the resurrection, and so on, and then ask about them. I agree. Yeah.
Well, I think it's an interesting question you raise when you say, well, I mean, even if that's such a minimal God isn't compatible with is compatible with scientific doctrine, maybe belief in it is incompatible with adherence to scientific method, which I think is a good way to put it. And I would agree with that, but then I think it does need to be recognised that it's a non-trivial and very, very difficult task to say exactly what those scientific methods are, less still to say why rationality compels you to apportion your beliefs to what they tell you, you should believe. So even at the just purely descriptive level, to characterise what scientific method is, when it goes beyond deductive logic, is a real tricky problem, and one that, in a way, is the central problematic of philosophy of science.
Yeah, I agree. And really, Samir might say, well, if he's being really strict, he might say that in fact his probability for the God hypothesis is 0.000, rather than, he might reject a dichotomous notion of believe or not believe. And
0.001.
What did I say?
0.000.
0.000 something.
Yeah.
Something down. But that is to say, if you're really strict about your scientific epistemology, you would probably have to say that you haven't ruled out the hypothesis conclusively. You just think it's got negligible probability.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you thought that there were non-enumerably many such hypotheses.
Right.
And you gave them all, measure 0.
Yeah, which you might.
Unless they have.
I mean, because if you were in Leon or something and you had ideas about how God relates to the infinite, then you might have a whole hierarchy of gods with associated with different levels of the hierarchy of sets. Yeah.
So there was this distinction made between pragmatic epistemology is that what it was called, or pragmatic theories of justification and epistemic theories of justification. So my question is, isn't Occam's razor just a pragmatic principle?
Ah, very good. So, well, I would call it epistemic. I would call it, how did I characterize it?
Well, you think it's epistemic.
No, but the distinction I wouldn't use to say it is epistemic versus pragmatic theories of justification. I would say it's epistemic versus pragmatic reasons for belief. And I really do think of that as a kind of, almost like a semantical ambiguity. When someone says, have they got good reason for that belief? You can, in one sense, then you're asking, can they adduce supporting reasons that rationally support it? And in another sense, you're asking, does it further their pragmatic ends? Right.
Or will their life go better if they believe it?
If they believe it, exactly. Yeah. In the same way that I've got kind of pragmatic reasons for many things that are nothing to do with belief. You know, I might have pragmatic reasons, you know, I don't know, for riding a bike rather than going on the bus or something, meaning my life will go better if I do. Now, you say, well, maybe Occam's razor is itself pragmatic, and I guess you could try and extend that argument to all sort of canons of rationality or non-deductive reason. I mean, yeah, I mean, that's one argument that you do get couched in slightly different terms in the philosophy of science literature, where people ask whether our preference for simple theories, our preference for simplicity, which is something that many scientists and philosophers of science will argue is a critical part of the scientific method. We don't just want a theory that fits the data, we want a simple theory. Some people have argued that the simplicity of the theory is grounds for thinking that it's true, while others say, no, 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 highly simple theories, they're better than their more complicated rivals, but for for practical reasons, it's easier to do the computations, it's kind of elegant, it's sort of nice, for reasons that have nothing to do with truth. And that's very closely related, I think, to the issue you're raising. And that's not an easy one to debate by any means, to resolve, rather. I mean, I tend to think that there is a notion of simplicity, a sort of minimal notion that you can argue, and indeed in some contexts even demonstrate it is going to lead you to truth, or more likely to than anything else. So it's valuable epistemically. But there are other notions of simplicity that you can only really defend as aesthetic desiderata on your scientific theories, and that's pragmatic. So I would argue that my own answer to that would be to say that the notion of simplicity, and hence the doctrine of Occam's razor, insofar as it's the doctrine to favour simple theories, is not a uniform, not a unified notion. In fact, needs to be disambiguated into a component that's strictly valuable epistemically and a component that's more pragmatically valuable. But those are big issues there. Do you have any views on that one, James?
I mean, this is a big discussion about why we should believe that simple theories are more likely to be true.
I mean, it's not even very easy to say what simplicity is. You know?
No, it's not. Some people, because traditionally the answer was, well, because God's made the universe for action intelligence. And so kind of made sense to think that, you know, well, God just wouldn't be deliberately making things hard, right? So if you concentrate hard, you're supposed to be able to find out the truth. And so things being as simple as they need to be and no more complicated can be, you know, well, God's rational, so he's made it that way. But if there isn't a God, why should they be no more complicated than they need to be? Maybe they could just be a right mess. And you know, some people think, well, they are actually, and that simplicity isn't a guide to truth. But I mean, the more general point I make is, of course, you can have pragmatic reasons to believe something false. I mean, for example, you might have pragmatic reasons to believe that, you know, as the example I always use in lectures, you know, that you're kind of basically an okay guy and people like you, right? You have pragmatic reasons to believe that because your life will go really badly if you don't believe that. And you wake up every morning and think, I'm not an okay guy and everybody dislikes me, then your day's going to go much worse, and people will probably like you even less than they would do otherwise if you go around with that kind of attitude, right? So, but because it doesn't follow that you really are an okay guy and that people really do like you, right? It's just, there are obviously less silly examples. I mean, for example, it wouldn't have done a 17th century scientist any good to have a few of our core scientific truths from now without the surrounding background. They would have been left unable to do any science. They were better off believing the half-truths that they believed, because they could do, in the context, they could do stuff with them. Right? There are lots of examples like that where, you know, if the true facts are more complicated and don't actually make a difference, you're better off believing something false if the falsity doesn't matter to how you're going to reason with it.
I think we've probably got time for one or two more questions. If anyone's got anything else.
I'll say something if you want. It's just an idea, but I mean, we're talking about beliefs as mental beliefs, but okay, scientifically there's something physical also, something physical associated with that. So could we have a belief where if you do believe it, if you do have that belief, then you can have some experience which confirms that belief. But if you don't have that belief, you can't have the experience, so you can never confirm it. I mean, it's sort of circle, but you have a belief, so this is a physical state.
Yeah.
And so being in that physical state, it's only if you're in that physical state that you could have this certain experience which will confirm that very belief. Which will be like proper justification, scientific justification for that very belief. But if you didn't have that belief, you wouldn't be able to experience that.
Can you give an example? Or?
Well,
No.
I think an example that's fairly similar to that, because there's a book recently. By the way, I mean, when you brought up Buddhism before, I mean, the reason I say we haven't decided what religion is, a lot of people say Buddhism is not religion, right? Precisely because it needn't have anything to do with anything spiritual or supernatural, I mean, anything supernatural in it. It needn't involve reincarnation or anything else. You can think of it as a practical psychology for living a happier life.
It transcends science, do they?
No, because no, Dalai Lama would say, no, it's all completely compatible with science, and in fact, where it conflicts with science, we have to believe science. That's what Dalai Lama is. He's on record as saying, where if there's any conflict, we believe science, right? So, and I take it he's an authority on Buddhism. So for lots of people, Buddhism is psychology. It's a practical means to being happier. And there's a book being produced recently called The Buddha's Brain that does the neuroscience of scanning people's brains, and these people are deeply experienced meditators. And they find their brains really function quite differently. The pattern of alpha waves and beta waves and gamma waves is very different and so on. Now, it's unlikely that you're going to attain the level of mastery of meditation required to get into the state of the brain that they're in, unless you believed that it was going to be worthwhile, because it takes years and years and loads of practice and diligence. So that's a slightly similar example. You can't show someone what it's like to have the experience of having it confirmed that you really will be happier if you follow all these techniques. You can't have that experience unless you do follow the techniques. But the scientific evidence is that the people who do follow the techniques are happier, and their brains function differently from the rest of us.
Yeah, I think we've got a last question here.
Mine is more a response. It reminded me slightly of a confirmation bias in psychology. So the beliefs you hold to influence the way you perceive the world. So that's what a similar case. Apparently lucky people are more likely to sort of notice a £10 note on the ground or something. In which case only people who did believe they were lucky would actually then have the evidence that they are lucky. So that might be a trend.
So lucky people are more likely to notice.
They've actually found that people who believe they're lucky, right, are more likely to be happy and think their lives are going well. And in fact, I mean, all these self-help books, and everyone took this out of them for a while, right? And now people actually think, no, geez, I mean, it's really frightening how well they work, right? Because I mean, one of the things that you do, this thing in psychology they found that people do better on intelligence tests if you put them in a room lined with books than a room not lined with books, right? I mean, that's astonishing, but fairly robust.
Yeah, you should read Daniel Kahneman's little piece in Science from a couple of weeks ago, where he's saying all of this stuff on priming.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's saying the problem with it, none of these experiments can be replicated reliably.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe an instance of this.
You read that?
Yeah. Judy is fantastic.
He's got a point, doesn't he?
He's got so many points.
Yeah.
Does it follow that every such case is
No.
No, it's not written to one point. It's written as
you have to be careful.
Yeah.
Believing this stuff.
Kind of, yeah. But like all the experiments that he puts in this, like it's like a theology of the brain kind of thing, or like the way that we work. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. It's about decision making.
Oh, that book, yeah, sure, no, and I was meaning specifically an argument that he's written in the journal Science just a couple of weeks ago, where he attacks the field of social psychology and the literature on priming, we both describing, by saying, in fact, it's a total disaster. And not that he doesn't think it ever happens, but more that a culture has arisen of making sort of claims on the basis of evidence that experiments that people just can't replicate consistently. I mean, it seems that, you replicate those experiments and you get all sorts of different stuff. Seems to be the problem. Sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. And so he's just suggesting it falls short of the standards of the best science.
Right, and we have to quote, the best thing ever said about luck was by Roosevelt, I think, who said, I believe in luck, and luck's very important, and the harder I work, the luckier I get.
All right.
Right.
Thanks, everyone.
If that's all, I think on that note we'll end this evening. I would hope that all of you would join me in saying a big thank you to Samir and James, and join me in a round of applause.
We're touching upon some important issues in epistemology there, so I hope that was,
Thanks for
that was
coming.
worthwhile for you anyway. Thanks a lot for coming, I'm really sorry I was late.
For everybody who's interested, there is a philosophy bar crawl pretty much starting as soon as this is over. If you hang around just outside the big room, we can take you to the first destination.
You going in the bar crawl? That's the